Hello and welcome to another video on this channel. Today we are going to be talking all things about Kafka's The Trial and the structure of totalitarian states, which you do see when you are indeed reading Kafka's The Trial. It's a very interesting book. We're going to be talking about a few of the different themes like existentialism, of course, politics, and also some of the key parts of it like before the law, his parable at the end said by the priest. Warren Zhu, I am joined with Warren Zhu to talk about it. I think Warren Zhu is quite knowledgeable about Kafka, though I think that was in the past. It's been quite a long time, if my memory serves me correctly, that both of us have wrestled with the works of Kafka. Though I do think that, especially with what's going on in Russia right now, I think it's quite interesting talking about totalitarian states. And we all know what the thumbnail is going to be for this short video. It'll be something like Russia destroyed or Putin destroyed, just to get a bit more clicks on it. But Warren Zhu, how are you?
I'm good. I think maybe you can start because I have some theories about Kafka's The Trial, but I don't think I have any coherency in all of my theories. So I want you to throw ideas, and I'll just like talk about them with you.
Indeed, and I think that that's one of the things where discussing Kafka's The Trial is indeed, it does become quite difficult because I think it's one of those books where, and perhaps this is just an overview, and we'll talk more about why you should read it later on in the video, but I think it's one of those books where you have a lot of different themes and you're able to read it from both a literary perspective, just as a story, and also interact with a philosophical perspective. I think that that's the beauty of Kafka's The Trial. In some sense, when you read Dostoevsky, perhaps, the thing is it's almost impossible to separate the philosophical underpinnings from its literary story. But with Kafka's The Trial, at least for me, it appeared that they were a bit more separate in the sense that you could enjoy the story qua story and then enjoy the philosophy qua philosophy. And I think one of the interesting things we could first start off with is the structure of totalitarian states. And one of the things which I noticed, and I think this is a key aspect which everyone who reads The Trial is focusing on, is indeed the fact that K doesn't know the crime he's committed, and he is sent off to a far discrete political system or a judicial system which no one really knows about. Yet at the same time, there's somewhat of a understanding that there is a judicial system which is completely different from the judicial system which he's caught up by. And there's like one conception of what the police should be, and then there's another conception of what the judicial system actually is. And then there's also a conflict between, does that our perception of the police system or the case perception of the police system, is that even a conception of the police system in the first place? Or what actually was that conception of? Because it does seem to appear that the only system which occurs is a judicial system which he encounters.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I've got two ideas with regard to K's crime, let's say. So one is, a hypothesis would be, what if K was actually guilty? Because I remember in the translation that I was reading, there was a footnote to the first few lines from the translator. And the translator said he specifically translated the line to mirror the original in German, which remains ambiguous to whether K actually committed the crime or not. And I think this is one thing we can explore. Whether any past sins or whether personal moral failings is lies at the bottom of the corruption of the state. That may be one line. And another line would be, well, it seems to me that K at the end was resigned to his fate of being assigned this anonymous crime and almost working within the system. And is this not, again, another of K's personal failings to me, as in, it is as much a sin to commit something morally wrong as it is for someone to accuse you of something morally wrong and you resigning to it and accepting it when you know that you haven't done anything wrong. And perhaps we can see in sort of accusations of implicit bias, etc., that's very common, which sometimes may be true, but a lot of times is false in common discourse right now.
And one of the things which I think you point out very well is the complicit nature that everyone has almost in a totalitarian state, in the sense that, and this is something that I was getting from a discussion with Yeonmi Park and Jordan B. Peterson, was when they said, well, basically everyone who is playing a role in the creation of a totalitarian state, especially one which has great control over education and brainwashing, is precisely the fact that people are unable to reach out to speak the truth and are unwilling to speak the truth against the common denominator, the common mode of being at the time. And when people are unafraid to speak the truth, in one sense, it becomes a universal thing. And when it becomes a universal thing, it's impossible to overcome it. And especially, I think what was very poignant in that discussion, I highly recommend you to go check it out, was the fact that a lot of people, unfortunately, when they're interacting with this system, was that they lost their conception of certain things. For example, in North Korea, you don't know you're oppressed because there was no conception for what oppressed meant. There's no conception of what being free meant. And in some sense, it's like when you are unwilling to, or perhaps this resignation, then creates a problem and is actually part of the problem, which is I wouldn't say universal guilt, but almost a guilt which is found within all of us.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And this idea from Hannah Arendt, pretty famous, called the banality of evil. And what she basically means by the banality of evil is that in bureaucracies, one can claim that one is merely following one's job, and one can, through that excuse, not assume any ability to any of the crimes that one has committed. Her example is Eichmann, who was this, I think, transportation organizer in Nazi Germany, managed to transfer, I don't know, like 3-4 million Jews into various concentration camps. And at the end, he claimed that he wasn't guilty because, well, he was just following the rules. And Hannah Arendt's claim was that evil does not lie in this deliberate, like, our common conception of the serial killer, where I just start stabbing people and laughing because they're suffering. But rather, evil can also exist in this complacency and complicity in a network of crimes, and the very avoidance of one's own guilt in the whole system.
I definitely think that is the case, and when perhaps you can look even further, where you see Kay's guards are being whipped, and he goes into the office and sees the guards are being whipped, and he goes back the next day and sees the guards are being whipped, and it's this kind of quite a perplexing thing in the sense that everyone who is part of the structure, or everyone who's playing part of the structure, is as well, or is as much a victim to the structure, and that there is in some sense no true, how would you call it? There is no true sufferer, or there's no true leader in the totalitarian system. Instead, everyone is indeed suffering, but also everyone is indeed enforcing their own suffering upon themselves, either intentionally or unintentionally.
Well, maybe there's a distinction between, let's say, authoritarianism and totalitarianism. And again, I'll use Hannah Arendt, I think, made this distinction, where he said this new totalitarianism of this bureaucratic state is so terrifying precisely because there was no leader and no autocrat who rules the whole thing. The whole thing just runs by itself, and what happens is that no one is in control, and because no one's in control, there's almost no way to change it. And what happens, I think, the most poignant scene in the trial is, I think, the last few lines where it describes how Kay was killed by some police guards, and then it says that he died like a dog. I think this deprivation of one's humanity into animality is what happens when you accept sort of this not necessarily oppression, that when you enter this structure of bureaucracy and follows it, remains complicit to it in this bureaucratic way, as in the banality of evil.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point. And what I think is even more curious about that last scene, now that you've raised it, is the idea that on his way to the execution, he says he sees a police constable on the side. Now, the question is that, well, if he was being arrested by police, then why on earth would there be another kind of police constable on the side as well, in some sense, ignoring or being somewhat ignorant to the situation? Because in some sense, you'll expect the police to know the other police's jobs and duties. And what makes it even stranger is that the execution is done on the side and not through a traditional police system. And what then occurs, or perhaps is there, you see somewhat of a separation between, and this is something we saw in Stalinist Russia and Maoist China to some extent, is the idea of the conflict within a party, in some sense, when I think it was Yagoda or whoever it was turns the NKVD against the state, in some sense, right? It's kind of that structure which you kind of find the situation that Kafka's K is thrown into somewhat suspect of, right? It's kind of this idea that what even seems as justice seems to have turned and fallen upon itself in some sense.
Well, an interesting thing is there's a lot of leftist critique against the police, and I think an interesting logic that they use that we can apply here is that part of the inner logic of the police requires police brutality, as in police brutality is not an exception of what the police is doing, but rather the very brutality is part and parcel of the working of the positive moral part of the police. And I think they use the same logic in things like, I can't remember any other example. I'll tell you when I remember others. But it's like this logic of the moral already contains its inverse that lies in, I think, totalitarian structures and it's a very strange logic. It's a bit like I would say it's like the sin against the Holy Ghost, or what was said in the Revelations, where I think Christ said, I don't want you to, the lukewarm person is worse than the one who's either cold or completely warm. In that, when evil and good become so entangled with each other and mixed, what happens is that there's really no chance for salvation, or no chance for the good to prevail, because the good itself is already corrupted, no matter how much you pursue it. And I think that's kind of the structure in a totalitarian state, in that it is impossible for one to even do good once one is in a structure, because the very pursuit of good in some way is already complicit in the evil.
I think you can push that even further, and in some sense, good becomes meaningless in a totalitarian state, in the sense that if you're looking at the control of language here, and I think North Korea is just the best example for it, right? And hopefully Kim Jong-un doesn't put us on the hit list of North Korean dissidents, right?
I don't think we're important enough, John.
Yes.
It goes to 1 million.
Yes. But then essentially what happens is, like, the concept of good loses its meaning if you don't actually understand what good and evil is in the first place. Because if you look at the syntactic, the nature between language and concepts, it's not necessarily, I don't adhere to the Wittgensteinian idea that or at least early Wittgenstein, in the sense that all language is just meaning, and the only way to see the world is via the words you see. But it is right in more of a psychological sense, in the sense that concepts are, we view the world through concepts, not necessarily words or language, but concepts are the fundamental thing. But if you don't teach people, and if people don't actually know what these concepts are, it then loses its meaning. Because in North Korea, you don't have the concept of what it means to be evil, because there's no evil existing in this socialist paradise. I mean, people are starving all around you, but you don't know that's evil, because that there's no concept of evil occurring to them, perhaps, or at least not in the same way that we interact with evil. And in the same way, that's what's going on with, like, well, there is good as well, right? And then, like, well, if you don't understand the concept fundamentally of what good is, it then loses its meaning. You could say good is this, good is that, good is everything, all you want to do, and call this a paradise. But unless you're fully understanding of the entire complexity of different concepts, and you have a freedom to interact and wrestle with each individual concepts freely, then each individual concept, in some ways, the network itself loses its meaning and its value and collapses entirely.
I got two ideas in relation to this. So recently, I feel like this is part of the poverty of materialism in some sense. So recently, I've been reading Hegel. So I read the Phenomenology of Spirit before, and now I'm going through the philosophy of right. And Hegel's idea is this: he says that what is most immediate, so things like sense perception, what we think is most material and most real, is actually the most abstract and the most formal. So what he says is, if we analyze sense perception and what we immediately see, we see that the white immediately dissolves into a mass of white. So the white itself has no identity within itself. It is not determinate, but rather it is the same as all the other white I perceive everywhere. And what gives the immediate, what we think as concrete, but rather is the most abstract thing, its identity and its determinacy, in Hegel's jargon, is exactly the concept. And it is when we don't have the concept, what we think, such things like suffering, what we think is the most immediate becomes vacuous and empty. So somehow it requires a certain conceptual rethinking and reevaluation in order for one to discover, in order for one to see, let me see. It sounds a bit like bullshit, to be honest.
Perhaps I could say something on this point, and I do think that when you're reading Hegel, in some sense, all of Hegel has to be reduced, not necessarily reduced, but has to be viewed from the perspective of historicism, perhaps. And a lot of people have been arguing that the only way to view Hegel is that his entire philosophy fundamentally ties down to his historicism. And perhaps Warren Drew can explain his historicism better than I do, just because I don't really have the...
Not historicist. That is the wrong reading of Hegel. Hegel is a fake...
So that's the interesting thing with Hegel. Mm-hmm. And though I do think that perhaps that ties into one of the things with the former totalitarian states in some sense, is that it's almost a false reduction of history, almost. And that's one of the things that people controlling states do very well, is to not only control history, but in some sense try to view the future of their own state as a result of the past that they created of their state. For example, you have the story of Kim Il-jung or whatever his name is, and they supposedly believe that he was born on a mountain and crafted his own people out of a mountain or something, whatever that story is, right? And then basically what happens is, well, if you start your history in a certain way, what they try to do is to enforce that history onto people, for people to act upon it in a certain way to live out a certain future. And that's kind of the structure of how totalitarian states use history in a very potent way to control people.
Yeah, and also, I think I kind of realized what my point was when I was using Hegel, was that there's this idea, very common, I think in the 2000s, where as long as there's economic prosperity, then everywhere will liberalize. The example that Americans always give was China. It's fine, China will liberalize in 10 years, seeing its economic growth. And what I think one can learn from analyzing totalitarianism is that it's the tyranny of the concept, tyranny of ideas, rather than material conditions that prevails, it seems, over the control. So thought is almost more important here in control rather than mere material stuff, which remains vacuous without the thought. And there's also another idea from Plato. I want to go back to the part we're talking about evil mixed with good. So I think it's the first book of the Republic. Plato's arch enemy is always a sophist, right? So there's almost two kinds of sophists. There's one sophist which just acts against the existence of the good. So there's one sophist who says, well, the good does not exist. But then there's another kind of sophist, which is the more, let's say, the higher level sophist, who not only says that the good does not exist, but is willing to say that the good exists, so long as when he says the good exists, it helps him win the argument. So this second sophist is a sophist who does not even care about the good at all. It uses the good for its instrumental means. And by using the good for his instrumental means, he is really destroying the good, rather than the other sophist who just denies the good. So there's this structure, I think, in totalitarianism of not only, it's not that I am denying the good, but rather I am using the good for my own instrumental means. And I think in the Yomi Park episode, she talked about how North Korea is actually built on this Christian narrative. And then it's maybe the same idea of there's something really good. And there's also the idea that it seems to me that the Soviet Union narrative also looks very theological, at least appears very theological. And it's almost this perversion of the good, not as an opposition, but as subsuming the good under incremental means that lies in totalitarianism.
Now, I think that this is a very interesting point where we can move on to our second discussion about, well, Kafka's existentialism, because, of course, discussing the nature of a totalitarian state cannot be separated from discussion of the nature of man in some degree, because you can't have the state without the man, and in the same way, the man is he who, in some sense, sustains the state to some degree, right? So what do you think is the core of Kafka's existentialist thoughts? Because I personally found the trial, and I think Metamorphosis is perhaps a better representation of his existentialism than the trial, because I just felt that Kafka's trial was mainly a focus, and correct me if I'm wrong or you think differently, was mainly a focus on totalitarian states instead.
I think for all great works of literature, you can analyze it on various levels of resolution. And in fact, I actually find the reading of the trial as an analysis of totalitarian states the least interesting one out of all the readings of the trial, simply because it is the most obvious reading, right? But in terms of Kafka's existentialism, I would say that there's a profound stuckness in all of his works. I don't know how to describe it. It's a sense in which one cannot find an opening towards anything, and no matter how much one reaches out, one ends up staying in the same place. I don't know how to describe it. I don't have a coherent theory of his existentialism, or I don't like the word existentialism even. I would even like to say it's Kafka's anthropology.
Indeed, I do think that there is that kind of nature to Kafka, in the sense that I don't think he's fully discussing. I think he's more wrestling with the kind of, instead of trying to figure out what is the nature of being, he's more focused on, well, what on earth is a response to the problems in which we see around us. In some sense.
What does it mean to be, rather than what is the nature of being, right?
Indeed. Mm-hmm. And I do think that one of the things which is very curious in the existentialist, or at least whatever Kafka's trying to wrestle with, is found within the unknown crime, in the sense that humans are put on the world despite not exactly knowing what on earth is the reason for him being thrown onto the world or put into this world. Though I'm not necessarily sure that's a correct analysis of Kafka, because that kind of interpretation of the world does seem to be a bit incorrect, I would say, or at least there seems to be way more knowledge of what on earth we're meant to do in the world than just having no understanding of what we're convicted of.
Well, I don't necessarily think that Kafka thinks that we have no idea where we're going, but rather, I think for Kafka always we have an extremely clear idea of the end that we're to pursue. Even in the castle, for example, Kay knows that he has to go to the castle. The problem, and I think he wrote it in one of his aphorisms, was, correct me if I'm wrong, I think I got this quote well. It's the problem is not knowing. We know where we're going, but we just don't know the way to the place, if you get what I mean. And I think that might be the problem with Kafka. It's not that everything is meaningless, but that the world is suffused with meaning. I can see where meaning lies, but I don't know how to get to there. That's a stuckness, because you won't be stuck if you think everything's meaningless. Many would even argue it's a great relief, because you're like, fuck it, I don't care anymore. I don't have to move to anywhere. One's only stuck if one wants to move somewhere.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's definitely an interesting reading of it, and in some ways there's this kind of conflict, I would suppose, then, which would arise as it's kind of like, well, and perhaps it's seen with his interaction with the different lawyers in some sense, where it does seem to suggest that the way of interacting with the world, and perhaps in some ways the lawyer represents a definite way in order to interact with the world which Kafka doesn't like. For example, maybe a religion, or whatever you want to call it, right? And in some sense, in order to interact with it, you have to also kind of reject it in some ways, and that's Kafka's, or at least Kay's, response is to reject I've pressed the wrong key on my keyboard, and now some random display has shown up. But rather that you have to, in some sense, reject the way forward, and in some sense find your own interpretation around it. Though it doesn't necessarily seem that finding your own interpretation around it is necessarily the correct one either, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. I don't think he even thinks that you're to find your own interpretation. Kafka is a deeply theological writer. I think he was very interested in Jewish mysticism, but also I found the actual quote. It's there is a destination, but no way there. What we refer as way is hesitation. So, and what for me, when I was reading the trial, there's this. I think this is it's very haunting. People like to describe Kafka as nightmarish, and it's almost this idea that what he's dealing with is like this really primal stuff. That's why it's nightmare, things that rises out in the dream. And this primal thing, I think what he was dealing in the trial as this primal thing, and I think David Foster Wallace said well in his essay on Kafka, it's this almost childish, nightmarish thing, rather than something that one can analyze, is a sense of guilt. I don't know. I always feel when I was reading the trial that somehow to be born is to be guilty in some way. That's something that Kafka was trying to get about, but I never figured out the mechanism by which one is guilty when one is born.
Mm-hmm. I definitely think that's the case, and
or maybe or maybe it's under a certain structure, under a totalitarian structure, the very fact that you're existing is already a proof of your guilt.
Mm-hmm. I think that's quite interesting, and perhaps that could turn us to our discussion of Before the Law by Kafka, one of his parables. And I think that this is one of the most interesting parables of Kafka, and because basically what happens in this parable, do you want me to explain, or do you want me to explain it?
You can explain that, because I haven't read it for a long time.
Indeed.
I don't want to tell you details.
So basically what happens is this lad, and the structure of this is Kafka is bringing an Italian lad to, or a customer to this church, but then the Italian customer doesn't show up, right? And you'll think that maybe it's like a drug lord, or like this like the Godfather-esque situation, but instead of actually getting killed by the mafia or something like that, right? What you then see is, well, he actually goes in and then meets a priest, and the priest basically gives him this parable. And what's very interesting about this is that, well, the connection, or at least the meaning of the how do you call it? The meaning of this, or interpretation of this parable isn't necessarily clear. And basically what happens in this parable is that the lad joins a few different situations. He joins a few different modes. He basically goes before a door, right? He's trying to access the law, or whatever you want to call it, the good or whatever, right? And he basically sees a doorkeeper, and the gatekeeper says, well, okay, come through me, but if you don't come through me, well, or go through me, then, well, you'll see another gate with a gatekeeper, which is even more terrible than I, and I can't even face the third or the fourth gatekeeper. So, but then the person really wants to interact with the gatekeeper or go through, so he stays there for the rest of his life, and he keeps on waiting and keeps on waiting. He's the only person at the gate, and before he dies, he's like, well, why on earth is there no one else coming? And the gatekeeper basically says, well, this door is only for you, and that's why no one else is coming. And then he dies like that. And it's quite a perplexing thing, because you don't exactly...
I think the door opens at the end, and he realizes that the door was never locked.
I'm not sure whether... I can't remember whether I read that. Did that occur?
Yeah.
Okay, so... And that's one of the perplexing things, and there's a few different interpretations, of which I am not really sure what's the correct interpretation to go for, because it does seem very perplexing to me.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one of it is this. I think it's related to our discussion before on Hegel and idealism, in that we like to say it's all in the mind, right? But what this Kafka was really saying is the biggest obstacle is not necessarily in doing a task, but opening up the field of possibility for that task to be done. In that, let's say in North Korea, you don't have the word freedom, then there's no possibility for one to be free. And the most difficult task is not necessarily to be free, which is just doing certain actions, but rather to make freedom a possibility. That is, one has to invent the concept of freedom, or at least reinvent it, in order for freedom to be able to, in order for freedom to be able to exist as actuality.
Mm-hmm. And I think building on that, the question would be is like, well, does that even accurately represent the situation in which K is, and perhaps is that view of existentialism, or that existentialist view, even compatible to what we've discussed before? Because it does seem to be, to me, that there is almost an intrinsic difference between the two, perhaps, and that in some ways they're not exactly in line. The suggestion going forward is exactly in line. Perhaps there's what is suggested here is that there's a few different approaches to this existentialist kind of mess, or this situation in which Kafka is in.
Mm-hmm. So what are the incompatibilities?
Because it seems to me that, or at least if we're looking at the few different approaches, right, you see in some ways that here with the interpretation that you just give, there's almost this idea that, well, you have to first open the door, in some sense, create that concept of seek and ye shall find in some degree, and knock and the door shall be opened unto you. But then there is also that kind of question of, well, is that necessarily compatible to the crime that one does not know, or at least is unaware of, that someone is facing, and also their relationship with the lawyer in some sense is like, well, is that necessarily the way forward? Like, it does appear to me that there is almost, in some sense, the seek and ye shall find seems to support the suggestion that K should, in some degree, follow the lawyer even further. Whereas the other one would say, well, perhaps you shouldn't be following the lawyer, and in fact, you should be following your own, not necessarily seeking your own path, but instead approaching it from a different perspective, perhaps. And of course, there's another character which he meets at the office of the lawyer, who uses multiple lawyers, but then is treated like a dog in some sense. But and in some way, you could suggest that no matter what way you try to pursue, you all end up like an animal or like a dog at the end. And there's this different interpretation as well, I suppose, and that's kind of where I'm saying that there is this incompatibility going on here.
Yeah. It's a tricky situation. Well, I'll just throw out more ideas, and maybe we can get the mess from different angles. One is, I don't know why, it reminds me of another Bible quote, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And you can think about that. I don't know why it reminds me of this. And then another is the lawyer episode. In the trial, they gave three different ways in which you can escape punishment. And two of those ways are sort of things of delaying your punishment by various ways. One way is by like keeping the punishment in like a lower down, to not let it bubble up into like an actual justice, for the justice to see the case. And another way that you can delay your punishment is to like bribe the justice to make so they don't look at the case. But there's always a possibility in that case for the justice to look at it again in maybe a few years' time. And the third, so these two are just postponing the punishment. And the third one is eliminating the possibility of punishment. And what's interesting about the third way is that a person told Kay that it was done before. It was once done maybe a long time ago, but it's impossible now. So I'm just wondering, there's almost an idea of the loss of a certain possibility, that something that was always already lost, as in it's not lost in a particular time, but it is felt as lost every single second of one's existence. And I don't know why that seems to me to be related to the whole guilt thing too, and the whole seek and ye shall find, and opening the door of law.
Mm-hmm. I think that perhaps that's an interesting, and perhaps that's quite a good interpretation of it. And what perhaps is also discussed by Kay and the priest is interaction between the doorkeeper and the person seeking, in some sense, that the doorkeeper himself like Kay believes that at the start believes that the doorkeeper is deceiving the person approaching it by saying, "Oh, I can't open the door for you right now." Or in some sense, the doorkeeper himself does not know what's beyond the doorkeeper himself. In some sense, the doorkeeper himself is afraid of the task. But at the same time, you could say, well, okay, well, but maybe it is the person approaching who hasn't taken enough courage to enter the door. But at the same time, it's like, well, when exactly did he have the chance to open the door? Because he dies his entire life and then just sitting in front of the door. So there perhaps is kind of a relationship between the doorkeeper and the person entering. And in some sense, you could question even further and saying, well, the purpose of the doorkeeper is predicated on the existence of the person approaching. But in the same sense, the person approaching is only there because of the door. And in some sense, there is some reciprocal relationship between the two, in the sense that perhaps the meaning of the world, or maybe the meaning of existence is itself predicated on the existence of human beings. But at the same time, it is part of the human nature, which exists precisely because of the question of being itself. And in some sense, that it's a circular relationship there.
But I feel like, okay, I've developed this theory of tragedy. And this theory of tragedy is that what really is tragedy is when the condition for the possibility of success is also the condition for the possibility of failure. Or something like failure is the condition of the possibility of success of the same thing. And success is a condition of the possibility of failure in the same thing. So something like a tragedy would be, it is tragic that I've loved, because I have loved that I can hate, or I can lose he or she whom I love. And this structure then I think fits very nicely into our discussion here. And when I was talking about this always already lostness and this guilt, this primal guilt that accompanies one when one's born, then is something like the very act of birth, the very possibility of salvation lies in being born, but the very act of being born also precludes the possibility of salvation with this certain guilt by being born into a certain structure in which one has no possibility of salvation. So in order for one to be saved, it must be impossible for one to be saved in order for it to be possible for one to be saved. This like strange structure here, which I analyze as a structure of tragedy, and I think is also why maybe Kafka talked about how the destination, that is salvation, or just pursuing the good, let's say, without using theological language. But one has no way there, because in order for one to see the end goal, which is the good, one necessarily has to already be fallen in some way. One has to be guilty in order for one to see the good. As in, it's really strange, because also it seems to me that, and I've been reading this critique of Kantian ethics, what it's saying is the Kantian ethics' focus on duty is really wrong, because you can only say something is duty, you can only put duty as something, or you say that one ought to do something if one already has an inclination against what one ought not to do, right? Then one cannot command or impel anyone to, let's say, love, because it has to come from oneself. And one can only see that one has not loved if one is not already loving. And there is no way for one go from the state of not loving to the state of loving, because that is not something that can be commanded. Therefore, linking back to the whole guilt discussion, the very guilt is a recognition of goodness. Because when you can recognize what is good, it already shows that you have fallen, or else you wouldn't need this recognition of the good and the pursuit of the good. The very fact that you need to pursue the good means that you are not good in multiple ways.
Mm-hmm. And perhaps this is the concept in Christianity, where you have precisely because humans cannot be saved by themselves, that Christ comes down to save humans in some sense. And perhaps this is the direct challenge to the humanist view that, no God can save us, we must save ourselves. The answer is no. It's like you cannot save yourself precisely because there is a God precisely because you cannot save yourself. And
once you think about you saving yourself, you're just like Kafka, who can see the castle but find no way there, because the very act of thinking about one has to save oneself means that there's already no road towards saving oneself. And there's also this interpretation of the New Testament by Hubert Dreyfus, where he says that the change between the old Jewish law and the new Christian law is that what Christ did was put everything onto the ontological level. And that rather than before, it's adultery is just you sleeping with another woman. And so long as you don't sleep with another woman, you're all fine. But now when you come to Christ, it's you can't even look at another woman lustfully. Then when you reach this level, it's impossible for not looking at someone lustfully to be commanded. It's like the famous experiment of don't think of an elephant and you're going to think of an elephant. And this lustfully thing is the whole thing. That's why Paul said, and the more I will, the more I will against my will, right? And the only way that one can escape this dilemma or jump out of this structure of totalitarianism in which one is primordially guilty because one does not have the concept and not the ability to it's not possible for one to engage in good actions because one does not have the concept, so the possibility is not open to oneself, is to undergo this transformation. And it's symbolically shown in Paul by him changing his name, and also I think shown how one needs to be in Christ or participate in Christ. And that's why one has to like drink Christ's blood and eat his flesh, right? Rather than just merely following his actions. So somehow one has to incorporate the good into oneself in order to change oneself as a person, in order for it to be possible for one to pursue the good. So the very pursuit of the good is not only requires a certain transformation, and that's also the strange thing. Okay, I'm now getting messy, right? It's also the strange thing because by changing oneself and transforming oneself, what happens is one becomes different to oneself. So one's old self has no way for salvation unless one symbolically suicides towards the other self, or symbolically dies in some way, maybe signified in the crucifixion, right? That's why Christians all need to wear the cross or bear the cross. And the bearing of the cross, in some sense, the participation in this process of transformation. I don't know. I threw out a lot of different ideas.
Mm-hmm. Well, I do think that what is most interesting here is that idea of the sacrifice, perhaps. But I think we can move on to our last section of this video and talk about why you should read the trial. So Warren Drew, why do you think you should read the trial? This could be a bit more of a light-hearted discussion, given the gravity of our previous parts.
I don't know. I think it's just a really good read. I think it's emotionally compelling. I think it's just good. I think it's. I've been reading Sherlock Holmes recently, right? And then what I've realized is that sometimes philosophizing about a story ruins it, and a compelling story just comes to one as compelling, and its value lies its compellingness. So the trial is compelling, so you should read it. It's a good book.
Indeed, I agree, and I think that it is a very simple discussion of complex issues, and one of the good things is, as we've talked about in the first place, is kind of how it has at the same time an interesting kind of perplexing literary nature, as well as the depth of philosophical analysis, which could be the case. And one of the interesting things I've noticed about reading these philosophical kind of novels or fiction is the idea that the only reason why people analyze it philosophically is because other people say it's philosophical. Like if people were like, oh, this book was Percy Jackson or whatever, right? No one would care about the philosophy or the ontology of it. But it's people saying, oh, Kafka is philosophical.
The problem is once you start reading a book philosophically, you can't stop anymore. So I mean, we're analyzing Sherlock Holmes, and I think it's a portrayal of British empiricism in excelsis.
So I do think that is a definite danger of reading the trial, but I do think it's an important part and an interesting part of reading the trial. Is there anything else you want to add about why you should read the trial, apart from the fact that it's a fascinating book? I completely agree with that analysis. I think it's a brilliant analysis of the human condition and also an analysis of the totalitarian structure.
I would suggest I would suggest oneself to read it at night, especially with like the lights turned off. And if you can, also like go out somewhere, not in your room, somewhere like without a lot of people around. Then you can really experience the nightmarish quality of Kafka's prose. There are those ones where I was reading the trial, and it was like near the end, and I was like outside. I took out my Kindle, started reading. It was at the night, and it was scary. It was of a different quality than reading at home. So I would suggest put yourself into some really, really isolating, really scary, really nightmarish environment in order to fully experience Kafka.
I definitely agree with that, and I think that getting into the mode of being with the book itself is a very important thing. and what comes immediately to my mind is the story of Warren Zhu, who perhaps should read this naked on the balcony, and the horror is not only occurring to himself, but the horror occurring to those observing him. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe. It means a lot to me, and it really helps this channel grow. Stay safe, my friends. I'll see you in the next video. Thank you for watching, and goodbye. I'll see you soon.